What is international law? What is going on between Israel and the Palestinians? And why does Israel always seem to be violating the human rights of Palestinians? These are one of the few questions that I will be asking to Mr. Andrew Tucker, who is a lawyer specialized in international law and also director of the organization thinc. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Sara.
Can you explain me what is thinc?
thinc is the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. We're a think tank based in The Hague, focusing on international law as it applies to Israel and the Jewish people. Precisely because we see so much discussion about this topic, we think it's really important to be thinking about it.
There's quite a lot of discussion. I mean, worldwide, everybody seems to have an opinion about Israel, about the Palestinians, about international law. So in this session, we're going to work through a number of terms that are being used, and one of them is international law. Can you give me a definition? What is international law?
So international law is basically the law of nations. It's the law that governs the way nations interact with each other. So it's nations that make international law. And it really developed, it's a very Western European thing, and it developed in the 17th century, the modern international law as we know it. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 was the beginning, and the basic idea of international law is sovereign states. States are sovereign, and the idea that developed at that time was the idea of sovereign equality of states. Meaning every state is equal and sovereign over its own territory, and you don't interfere in the internal affairs of other states. That was the idea at that time, and it held Europe in a kind of a balance of powers.
You say in that time, was there like an evolution in international law?
International law is changing every day. It's a moving, developing, evolving creature. And I would say that international law as we know it today is a vastly different creature than it was 300 years ago.
In what way?
Thinking changes. Nations have changed so much. We live in a global world where nations are interconnected. And the idea of sovereignty, I think, is something that people struggle with today. And we see it coming up in so many areas. This tension really between nations claiming sovereignty over their own affairs, but also wanting to participate on the international stage and to organise things globally. And this is, I think, the theme, the tension that is having to be resolved now. And when it comes to Israel, Israel's right in the middle of that conflict.
Right. You're also talking about sovereignty. What is the definition of sovereignty?
Sovereignty is simply the, let's say, the power, the jurisdiction of a state over its people and its territory.
When is a country sovereign?
A country is sovereign when it has freedom to make its own decisions and to govern independently. So the theory is that every state is independent. And so the idea of statehood is very much about sovereignty. You can only be a state if you have sovereignty.
Right.
You can only have territorial jurisdiction if you are a sovereign power.
Right.
And it means you have to have a government, you have to have a territory, and you have to have a people.
So government, territory, people.
They're really the three main ideas.
What are the sources of international law?
Yeah, good question. I mean, traditionally, the sources of international law is primarily what states do. It's called customary international law. So you look at the way states interact, and you kind of work out from that the rules that they are developing. So when states start to develop a rule, think of principles as well. You know, over time, principles have developed that states accept as being, let's say, self-explanatory, like slavery is forbidden, or a principle that's developed over the recent decades, peoples have a right to self-determination. That becomes so ingrained in the international world order that we accept it as a principle, and therefore it governs all nations. The other main source of international law is treaties.
So treaties are agreements between countries, right?
Yeah, they're agreements between countries that countries enter into voluntarily. They consent, they use their sovereignty, they give up their sovereignty in a way, but they agree consensually to a certain range of activities or goals that they want to achieve.
Can you give me an example of a treaty?
Well, think of the environment. You know, goals have been set in the Treaty of Paris, for example. International institutions are set up by treaties. The UN is set up by the UN Charter, which is a treaty between nations in 1945.
And it all falls under international law?
It's all part of international law. It's all about the way that international relations is organised.
You mentioned 1945. What kind of change happened? Because it was the end of World War II. Was there a change in international law in this period?
I think you could probably say that international law went through the most fundamental metamorphosis that it's gone through in 1945. Coming out of the incomprehensible tragedy of the Second World War, the League of Nations, which had been set up after the First World War, had failed. It had not been capable of preventing the Second World War. And so people were looking for a new world order. How can we prevent this kind of catastrophe?
So they came together and asked themselves this question.
At the end of 1945 and set up the United Nations. United Nations, as I said, is a treaty that nations enter into by consent. And the United Nations has become really the body of international law. It's the framework, it's also the place where most international law is developed. But we have to remember that international law is not like law we have in our own countries. You know, in your own country you have a legislature, a parliament, you have an executive that carries out the law, and you have independent judiciary that makes decisions. You don't have
three powers,
the three powers. You don't have that in international law. The United Nations is not a legislature, it doesn't make law in that sense, neither the General Assembly nor the Security Council. You don't have a judiciary, a court that can make a binding decision for everybody, and you don't have an executive.
So
well,
how
I think
does
it's moving
it work?
in that direction.
How does it work then?
Well, it moves in a strange kind of a way, and I think what we're seeing now is a move towards a kind of a world government, and the UN is the main vehicle for that happening, and it's inevitable. You know, decisions need to be made, action needs to be taken. So the Security Council, I think, is becoming more and more important. The General Assembly is being seen more and more as a kind of a law-making body, even though resolutions...
Some kind of an international parliament, you would say?
I think so, although it technically doesn't really have that role. But, you know, when a majority of states come together and make resolutions time and again, it becomes seen as being a kind of law.
And this is a change, in international law?
It's a huge change.
Can you try to describe to me, for example, if you give me an example, so that people can understand what is exactly the change?
Okay, so let's focus on Israel then. Since 1945, the UN General Assembly has time and again said that settlements are illegal, or that the territories of Judea and Samaria, they don't call them Judea and Samaria, the occupied territories are occupied territories, and they belong to the Palestinian people. Now, in my view, these are political statements. They're not legal statements. They don't make law. But when it's said over and over and time again, it becomes a kind of principle that people accept. Because the states are saying it, so many states are saying it, it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
And gets repeated.
So if you repeat it over again, it becomes true, you say?
I think so. I think that's kind of the way it works.
Yeah. Right. So, talking about the UN, because you mentioned that the UN has been saying already for a long time that Israel is occupying certain territories. How important is it that the UN is saying this? How much power do they have saying that?
I think it has an enormous power. The General Assembly has really become the platform through which this has happened. Every state in the General Assembly has a vote. The nations vote in blocks of powers. They're organised into regional blocks. They're also organised into ideological blocks of powers. So most of the decision making is made behind the scenes before a resolution ever gets put on the table. It's been thought up somewhere. It's been drafted. It's drafted in committees. And most of the resolutions relating to Israel and the so-called Arab-Israeli conflict or Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whatever you want to call it, have been developed coming out of the, let's say, the Arab worlds and the Islamic worlds, cooperating with the Soviet nations before the end of the 1980s, African nations, South American nations, to form a majority which can pass resolutions. Most resolutions are not unanimous. It's a majority that adopts resolutions. There's always a minority
who rejects it.
That either rejects it or simply doesn't vote.
Yeah.
You know, you have a lot of nations who don't take a position.
But are you saying that it's secretly prepared somewhere in a room?
It's not secret. There's nothing
to
secret about it. It's not secret, but it is very political. You know, the Arab League, the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, these are very powerful bodies, and they're quite transparent. You know, we all know what's going on.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I think that, you know, this idea then of occupation, which really developed after the Six-Day War in 1967, when Jordan was occupying these territories after 1949 through to 67, nobody was really concerned about the law of occupation. But suddenly they were after 1967. And I think really after the Yom Kippur War of 73,
yes,
when the Palestinians really mobilized themselves and the Arab world to develop the idea that these are occupied territories and therefore don't belong to the state of Israel.
But if it's not occupied, you're one of the few lawyers, I think, in the world who is saying that the territory is not occupied, and 95% maybe of the lawyers say it is occupied. So what is the truth? There should be one truth, no?
Yeah. Look, it's a difficult question because the law of occupation, it's a body of international law and it's mainly through treaties. The most important being the Fourth Geneva Convention,
which is
1949, and the Fourth Geneva Convention. It's about protecting the populations of occupied territories. It's a very important body of law. Now, it was developed really in response to what happened in the Second World War, when Russia and Germany were ethnically cleansing parts of Europe and, you know, putting their own population groups into there. We don't want that to happen anymore. And technically speaking, you know, I can agree that the law of occupation applies to the territories of Judea and Samaria. The question is, what does it mean? And Israel has always said, well, we don't think it applies as a matter of law, but we apply the law of occupation in a humanitarian law sense. We apply it in practice because we want to protect the Palestinian people. And I think they do a pretty good job of that. But my point is, I think you have to take it in its context. And the context is that Israel and the Jewish people have always had a claim to these territories. And that's very different from, let's say, Russia invading Crimea or Turkey invading northern Cyprus.
In what way is it different?
Because I think the Jewish people have a historical and I think a legal connection with the territories that Turkey certainly did not have in northern Cyprus. And I don't think Russia has in Crimea either. And that comes through the history of the creation of the State of Israel, which came out of the mandate for Palestine.
And the mandate for Palestine was given to the British so that there could be a Jewish homeland, right?
Yeah, it wasn't given to the British. The British had the responsibility for administering the mandate. The mandate was an international institution, treaty actually, set up under the League of Nations, where 51 League of Nations states said, we agree there should be a Jewish homeland in this territory of Palestine. Why? Because the Jewish people have a special relationship with the land, and they have an inherent right to re-establish their homeland in this territory.
That's the idea behind it.
That was the idea of the mandate. Just like it was said that the Arab world would gain control over most of the rest of the Middle East. So the world community at that time accepted some kind of inherent right, you could say, I think, of the Jewish people to their homeland. Now, that evolved into the State of Israel, and the British had the role to make sure that Jewish homeland would be established.
And it was established in 1948, but the fact of the matter remains that the whole international community is condemning Israel that they are occupying the West Bank. So what would be a good answer to that accusation?
First of all, I think it's important to recognise that in 1967, when Israel won the Six-Day War, they had the opportunity then to incorporate all of that territory.
To annex it.
You call it annexation. I don't think it's annexation, because annexation is a word you use when you're incorporating territory that has never belonged to you. Israel could have said at that point in time, looking back, that these territories already belong to Israel because of the mandate. Now, it's a legal line of thinking which I don't think was very prevalent at that time. And Israel took a political position. They said, we will incorporate Jerusalem. Very important, they did that. They reunited Jerusalem. I don't think they necessarily explained very well why, legally, the basis for doing that. But they always had the idea that Jerusalem is so much an integral part
of the Jewish
of
state.
the Jewish homeland, it makes sense.
Right.
But in the eyes of the world, they saw Jerusalem as belonging to the Arab world.
Right.
At least that's the idea that has developed.
And it's still the discussion that's going on
still
today.
There. Most states in the world do not accept that Jerusalem is legally part of the State of Israel. And then you had the rest of the West Bank, as it had become known. And Israel took this position that they would not incorporate it, but they would kind of occupy it.
Kind of.
Practically they are occupying it. So we have to recognise that. And I think it's important that this occupation comes to an end, because you do have a situation where there is a difference between the way Israelis are dealt with and non-Israelis in those territories.
Right.
And you have a kind of a strange situation now because of the Oslo agreements and the creation of Palestinian Authority and so forth. It's very complicated, but it's not satisfactory.
No. It brings me to my next point, that often is said that Israel is violating human rights of the Palestinians. Yeah, you say. You agree with that?
Look, of course Israel is violating rights of Palestinians, just like we live in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is violating the rights of all kinds of groups.
But isn't it good that the international community then is speaking out against these violations?
To an extent, I think so. I think Israel, like any other country, is subject to international law, including the law of human rights. What I think is problematic is the imbalanced way in which this is happening. The only human rights that seem to be relevant are the rights of certain Palestinian people under the occupation.
And would you say it's like this? Because people are also worried about what's happening in Syria or what's happening in Afghanistan or all these countries where human rights are being violated. It's not only Israel, yeah?
That's true. But Israel is the only country in the world which has a permanent place on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council. It's the only country where time and time again, if you look at the number of resolutions, the number of decisions that are made about Israel's breach of human rights, it's imbalanced. I think everybody will agree with that. Whereas I think if you look at it in perspective, relatively, Israel is surely not the worst infringer of human rights on earth, but you have that impression. Now, I think there are issues, I really do, but the problem is really not one of human rights.
It's more the imbalance, which is the problem, you think?
Yeah, I think it's the imbalance, but I think it's more about how do we resolve this situation that we have where, you know, Israel has a military administration in these territories. Palestinians haven't achieved the autonomy that they would like to achieve, and yet Israel cannot simply withdraw, because if it does so, it will be chaos. And the result is, you know, there's tension. Israel is having to deal with Palestinian terror. So it's very easy to blame Israel for human rights violations, but if you look at it from their perspective, I think Israel is upholding the law of human rights better than most countries in the world in the circumstances.
But every now and then, let's say every few years, there is a war going on, and that's also one of the accusations that's being made against Israel. Israel is violating or is committing war crime.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
This is very complicated. International humanitarian law is the law of war, governs the way you can conduct yourself in a conflict situation. Now, there's two main areas where this happens. One is the Gaza Strip and the other is Lebanon. And every time Israel responds to acts of aggression from Hamas in Gaza, takes military action. Okay, you have to remember, Israel is withdrawn from Gaza. It no longer considers Gaza part of the state of Israel. It's run by a terrorist organisation, Hamas, whose very goal is to destroy the state of Israel. Like
so this is the situation that
Lebanon.
Israel has to work with, you said?
So what do? They have to manage this somehow. So they use force. There's only way to deal with this is the use of force. But every time they do it, everybody jumps up and says Israel is using an excessive amount, a disproportionate amount of force. Now, I think that's problematic because every conflict situation you need to look at what is the idea of proportionality means you have to look at every specific situation. And you know, there are those who say that Israel again tries to comply with international humanitarian law. You have to just compare it with the way Russia operates in occupied territories or Turkey in Syria. And you have to see how Israel is governed by the rule of law. And they don't do anything. Of course they make mistakes. People are killed when they shouldn't be. That's the same in any conflict situation. So there will always be violations of international law. But to accuse Israel of the gross violation that people talk about, I think is just in itself disproportionate because it fails to take account, I think, of the unique challenges that Israel faces. You only have to think, for example, how small Israel is. How close it is. You know, rockets being fired by Hamas out of the Gaza Strip can reach Tel Aviv, Jerusalem.
Because the country is so small.
Because the country is so small.
So regarding all these challenges that Israel has, so why does the UN or the international community has such a focus on Israel, you think?
Good question. I think one explanation is that it's very convenient. It's very nice to have a country that everybody can accuse of wrongdoing. It diverts attention from other things.
You mean they're like a scapegoat?
In a way, I think they are. You know, it's very easy for the Arab world, for example, to coalesce around the state of Israel because they can put aside all their other differences and focus on this one enemy. I think you're seeing a change in this respect, by the way, with this sort of new normalization of relations between Israel and a number of Arab countries. But nevertheless, there is this obsession, and I think this applies to Europe as well. Europe has played a very strange and problematic role in all of this. Europe is very obsessed with Jerusalem.
Why is Europe so obsessed?
I think it's got to do with a kind of a guilt complex. On the one hand, for the way they've dealt with the Jewish people, but on the other hand, for the way they've enabled the state of Israel to come into existence.
It's some kind of
at
twisted
the expense
guilt
of the
feeling.
Palestinians.
Yeah.
So, and I think you can explain it spiritually as well. At the end of the day, I think that's the only explanation. There is no rational reason why people should be so focused on this city, which, let's face it, is a small city.
You're talking about Jerusalem.
I'm talking about Jerusalem. Yeah. There are many more important cities in the world, and yet it seems to be an idea that we need to control Jerusalem, we, the West, we, the international community. Because if Israel does, if the Jewish people have control over Jerusalem, then somehow this is leading to conflict, and we don't like conflict.
But so you say it has also a spiritual impact, or a spiritual level, actually. But what is the spiritual battle then that's going on?
Well, I think, biblically speaking, the Bible talks about Jerusalem being a stumbling block for the nations, a rock that cannot be moved. Look at Zechariah chapter 12 through to 14, for example. This is very much, I think, about the end times, the times preceding the coming of Messiah. And the nations, for one reason or another, and the prophet Zechariah says it's inexplicable. It becomes this cup of trembling which so grips the nations that they want to lift this stone, and the result of doing so is to destroy themselves.
Right.
So you are seeing, I think, now the nations gathering around Jerusalem, and it wouldn't surprise me if, I think you're seeing it legally, because you just have to look at what's happening in the International Criminal Court, for example, at the moment. The case that is going on is about the status of Jerusalem particularly.
So it's all going about Jerusalem.
So I think it's going about Jerusalem, and I think you're having a scenario being developed whereby the nations can take action to prevent the Jewish people from controlling Jerusalem.
Yeah. Last question, Andrew. Where is this going to? Because it doesn't seem very positive, but where do we as Christians believe in that it's going to?
So I think at the end of the day, you know, our hope as Christians is the kingdom, the coming of the kingdom. It's the coming of the King of the kingdom. And the King is coming to Jerusalem. You know, the angel Gabriel said to Mary that Jesus would sit on the throne of his father David in the midst of Jacob. Well, David ruled over his kingdom from Jerusalem. And I think we are called to believe that the physical Jerusalem is important. Not only the heavenly Jerusalem, but also the physical, the territorial Jerusalem. Why? Because Christ is coming to establish his kingdom on earth. And the Jewish people will be the first among nations. We don't like to hear that as nations. It sounds problematic to us, but the Lord is going to use and is using the Jewish people. He's bringing them home to Jerusalem in order that they will be ready for him, and the law of the Lord will go forth from Jerusalem into the nations, as Isaiah said.
So not the international law, but the law of the Lord will be there.
The law will not go forth from New York, I'm afraid, but from Jerusalem.
Great.
And it's the law of the Lord, not the law of the United Nations.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew Tucker.
Pleasure.
And thank you for watching this interview about international law. If you'd like to learn more about international law, about Israel and about the Bible, I would like to refer you to our website cforisrael.org or our YouTube channel, where you can find many more videos and teachings about Israel and about the Bible. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.